Welcome to my podcast, Scientist Free from Religion. This podcast has as proposal, as main idea to talk about a scientific topic but also talk about religion. Different from the common assumption in which science and religion should be separated, here on this podcast we recognize formally that science and religion are not disconnected. Sadly, religion can be a very big threat to science. So on this podcast, the proposal is to talk about it freely, so without fear, without the illusion that they are separate topics. So we are going to cover a possible topic. And most of them will be focused on the connection between religion and science, especially to defend science. That's our goal. Our goal here is to defend science from religion and to help to make science, to spread scientific thinking, especially to defend it against religion.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up a conversation that it takes a running leap right over one of the most sacred cows in Western thought.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going far beyond just, a simple religious disagreement. We're going straight into a really profound moral and philosophical reevaluation of love itself.
That's right. When you think of faith, you almost automatically pair it with concepts like, unconditional love, selflessness, benevolence. But the sources you shared with us, stemming from the work of Brazilian atheist activists Eduardo Banks and Jorge Garapires, well, they put forward this radical preference.
It's one so sharp it almost sounds like a contradiction when you first hear it.
Exactly. They say they prefer secular anger over religious love.
It's not just a claim. It's a full-scale assault on a foundational concept. The mission today is to unpack the historical, theological, and psychological arguments that lead Banks and Pires to label Christian agape.
That divinely mandated unconditional love.
Right. To label that love as fundamentally coercive, conditional, and even dangerous.
And then they contrast it with the moral clarity they find in a purely secular, autonomous emotional life.
It seems like we're dealing with a sophisticated two-pronged critique here.
You are. Banks provides the dense, historically grounded analysis. He argues that agape is essentially narcissistic, a form of self-love that's just projected onto other people.
And that its track record is not great.
Historically devastating is how he puts it. Then Pires comes in, using more modern psychology, and he focuses on the control mechanisms.
How the label of love operates in the modern era.
Yeah, as a profound form of moral blackmail to enforce submission.
So we are diving into a debate where the stakes are the very definitions we use to govern our lives. What actually qualifies as love? What counts as justifiable anger?
And critically, in a world dominated by information, who gets to decide your emotional and moral capacity?
We are scrutinizing the possibility of a complete, natural, and truly autonomous secular morality against this long-standing claim that Christian agape isn't just good, but that it's superior and necessary for true human compassion.
It's a huge topic.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So, to really appreciate the sharpness of Banks' critique, we need to first establish the specific polemical context he was responding to.
Right, this didn't come out of nowhere.
Not at all. Banks was engaging with a formal debate that articulated this exact tension. On one side, you had Professor Ricardo Oliveira da Silva, an atheist, who argued forcefully that loving one's neighbor is entirely possible and, natural, without any belief in God.
And on the other side?
On the other side was Vitor Hugo de Souza Carneiro, a Pentecostal advocate. And he maintained that this so-called natural love is fundamentally deficient.
That it just can't compare.
Exactly, that it can't compare to the superiority of Christian love.
That sets up the perfect dichotomy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Human capability versus divine necessity. You can either achieve morality through your own reason and empathy, or you have to rely on divine intervention.
Precisely. And Banks makes this brilliant initial observation about the structural difference in their arguments.
How so?
He notes that Silva, the atheist, analyzes the problem from outside. Atheism doesn't claim to be a competing religion, so it can provide this sort of objective philosophical scrutiny.
Whereas Carneiro, the Pentecostal advocate,
he argues from within the Pentecostal cosmovision, and this internal framework, Banks notes, traps Carneiro almost immediately in a devastating logical failure.
What's the failure?
It's known as the petition of principle.
Ah, the classic flaw, where you use your conclusion as a premise. You're basically assuming what you're trying to prove.
You got it. Carnera's mission was to prove the excellence and superiority of Christian love.
But how did he fall into that trap?
To prove it, he exclusively cited internal Christian sources. Quotes from Leviticus, the first epistle of S. John, the Gospel according to S. Matthew.
Okay, so all from within the system.
And texts from foundational theologians like Tertullian, Luther, and Calvin. Banks argues, quite pointedly, that this is self-defeating.
I can see why. It's like you can't prove the objective superiority of your product by solely quoting the marketing materials created by the manufacturer.
Which already assert that superiority. It's a closed system.
So it's not just a logical error. It's a structural barrier against self-correction.
Yeah.
Banks is arguing that if a moral system refuses external, secular, or philosophical scrutiny,
then it forfeits the right to make universal moral claims.
and this brings us to the need to actually define what we're talking about. What are these different kinds of love?
Right. Banks contrasts the Greek concepts which form the basis of this natural love with agape. The Greeks categorized love. You had eros.
Romantic, passionate desire.
Right, often intense and personal. And then you had philia, which is more of a friendly, fraternal, or familial affection, the love of community and partnership.
And those forms of love seem to be grounded in reciprocity and mutual recognition.
They are. Agape, by contrast, is typically defined as a selfless, unconditional, non-reciprocal love that is divinely mandated.
It's love as a duty.
Love as a virtue or duty, yeah, independent of the merit or desirability of the person you're loving. And Banks's sources, through Silva, argue that these natural, non-divine forms are entirely sufficient for building a functioning ethical society.
So what does that secular moral stance actually look like in this debate?
Yep.
If you take away the divine imperative of agape, what grounds your morality?
Well, Silva's position, as detailed by Banks, is that a complete secular morality is entirely possible. It doesn't require any metaphysical prerequisites.
It's established by what? Human agreement.
Human consensus and rational self-interest and social harmony. He suggests that we can all agree on core principles for individual and collective life.
Like don't
Steal, don't kill, don't torture, don't exploit people, don't be dishonest. Oh, and don't mistreat animals.
These principles, he's saying, just stand on their own.
They stand alone. They are agreed upon because they are adequate for human survival and flourishing, regardless of whether you believe in a god or not. The necessity for agape is therefore dissolved by this demonstrated capacity for ethical autonomy.
That sets the stage perfectly. Banks has established that agape is defended with internal, non-testable logic.
Exactly.
Now he has to demonstrate that the practical results of that supposedly superior love are, in fact, inferior. And this is where it gets really interesting, because he immediately counters the moral claims of agape by pointing directly to history.
The blood-soaked application of this unconditional love.
Yeah. Banks doesn't just stick to philosophical arguments. He forces religious advocates to confront this really inconvenient historical record.
He lists events that are often sanitized or overlooked when people discuss the purity of Christian love.
So if agape is truly the zenith of human affection,
Right.
what does his historical track record actually reveal?
Well, Banks unleashes a devastating litany of historical events that were carried out under the banner of this love. He mentions the Crusades, the centuries of the Inquisition, the mass hysteria of the witch hunts, and the sheer scale of the religious wars, the Catholic versus Protestant carnages. He specifically cites the 30 Years' War,
Which fundamentally reshaped Europe and killed millions.
all in the name of theological correctness. And these weren't just political or economic conflicts. They were justified through a theological mandate.
They were seen as holy.
Exactly. And Banks doesn't let you keep these horrors at a safe historical distance. He brings it into the modern era.
How so?
He cites the localized yet equally horrifying Salem witch trials in Massachusetts in 1692.
Okay.
He also evokes the disturbing context of 17th century French convents and the alleged demonic possessions there, drawing on a history by Jules Michelet and this really eerie 1922 silent film called Hexen.
By citing Hexen and the French convent cases, he's highlighting the psychological terror and the control over women's bodies and minds that was executed under religious authority.
That's the pattern. And connecting the past to the present, Banks notes the modern intolerance scene in Brazil. Specifically conflicts targeting followers of African matrix religions, which he says are often impelled by the aggressive preaching of Pentecostals.
So he's creating an evidentiary chain.
He is. If the outcome of your superior love is violence, subjugation, and societal fracturing, then what species of love are we actually discussing? It forces you, the listener, to question the inherent benevolence of the concept.
And the critical point here is whether the violence occurred despite the love, or whether the love, in its desire for absolute obedience, actually justified the violence.
Banks insists on the latter, and he finds powerful support in Nietzsche's diagnosis from beyond the good and evil.
What did Nietzsche say?
Nietzsche famously asserted that the only thing stopping Christians today from burning non-believers is the impotence of their love, not some transformation of their moral convictions.
Wow. That is a profoundly challenging viewpoint.
Correct.
Suggests that any moral reform or tolerance we observe isn't a result of agape purifying the soul,
But simply a consequence of diminished political and legal power.
And if you look at the historical justification for the violence, Nietzsche's cynicism seems, well, justified.
It does. The logic behind the Inquisition's cruelty was that it was a loving act. It was better, in their view, to destroy the non-Christian's body to save their immortal soul from eternal sin and damnation.
So the burning was an act of love.
Banks points to the tradition of offering final sacraments at the auto de fe as proof of this. The burning wasn't hatred. It was the ultimate, albeit brutal, act of salvation. The violence was an act of conditional love.
This moves the discussion from the historical consequences of agape to its core theological mandate, specifically the first commandment.
You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and above all things.
Right. And Banks argues that strict adherence to this commandment-loving God above everything else makes genuine, autonomous love for your neighbor utterly impossible.
Because if God occupies the highest and most comprehensive category of affection, then everyone else is automatically demoted.
So the neighbor is loved only in a derived sense. They become merely a means to express or reflect that original superior love for God.
Exactly. Others are loved only to the extent they reflect the imago Dei, the image of God.
So the Christian is, by this analysis, only really loving God.
That's what Banks posits. Everyone else, family, fellow believers, the nation, non-Christians, is loved based on how closely they imitate or reflect the divine.
He calls this a sick and exclusivist way of living the psychic life.
It creates a narcissistic loop where the Christian is merely loving the divine reflection they believe they possess and project onto others.
And that's where the power of the critique lies.
Yeah.
It denies the intrinsic, non-theological value of the neighbor. They don't matter in and of themselves.
And to illustrate this transactional, conditional species of love, Banks uses this really potent, everyday analogy.
What's the analogy?
He says it's like caring for an elderly, ill father only because you are expecting a significant inheritance upon his death. Your affection and your acts of service are not centered on the father's intrinsic worth, but on the expected future reward. The act of love is a strategic investment in self-benefit.
That analogy, the transactional nature of the expected inheritance, is incredibly effective because it immediately turns a complex philosophical critique into a petty, relatable motivation.
It really does.
It drives home the issue of denied autonomy and selfish intent cloaked in piety.
And this prioritization of divine loyalty over human connection has concrete, deleterious repercussions in interpersonal relationships, which the sources highlight with legal and historical examples.
We're talking about the dissolution of relationships following conversion.
Precisely. Banks cites the Pauline privilege and the later Petrine privilege, which authorized divorce or a new marriage when a non-converting spouse refuses to, live harmoniously with the newly converted Christian.
So the bond of faith is made superior to the bond of marriage.
And these permissions were powerful tools of coercion during the colonial era, too.
How were they used?
They were used to break up families to enforce conversion. The sources cite Saint José de Anchieta's strategy in Brazil, where he would convert indigenous children.
Hurumans.
Right. And then he'd use the threat of separating those children from their parents to pressure the parents into converting. The threat of familial dissolution became a missionary tool.
And maybe the most shocking example of prioritizing religious purity over civil law and familial bonds is the 19th century Mortara case.
The Mortara case, which Banks brings up, really demonstrates the peak of this hierarchical love. In Bologna, 1858, Pope Pius IX had a Jewish child, Edgard Mortara, removed from his parents. Because a Christian maid had secretly baptized the boy years earlier when he was ill. The logic was that the boy, having received the saving grace of baptism, could not be raised by non-Christians.
That's incredible.
Banks notes that this specific violation of paternal and civil rights was a major international incident and became the catalyst for the ultimate dissolution of the papal state.
So the core takeaway from all these examples
Is that Christian love, when enforced by institutional power, is always prioritized over human affection, natural law, and secular authority.
Okay, so Banks' critique presents a difficult problem for the religious advocate. How do you explain the observable empirical fact that non-Christians perform genuinely good, moral, and loving acts?
Right. If only Christian agape is true love, why are non-believers also compassionate?
This is where the theological counterargument comes in, which Banks identifies in the work of Carnero.
The doctrine of common grace.
Which is what, exactly?
It's the theological escape hatch. Carnero argues that any goodness observed in non-Christians is explained by common grace, which is God's favor that restricts evil and generously grants virtues even to the impious.
The sources provide a specific citation from Calvin, right?
Yes, from John Calvin's Institutes. Common grace is defined as a gift of God to all humanity, by which he preserves order and grants virtues even to the impious.
Hey there, thanks for being around. We are going to make a small break. I'm going to share with you my books. I have several books. So far, all my books about religion, atheism, which have been published a lot, they are in Portuguese, which is my main focus. But if you are interested, you can still buy my books to help me to support my work. I have several books. For example, one book that I'd like to recommend now is AI by Sci-Fi. AI by Sci-Fi is a book that talks about artificial intelligence, which is everyone is talking about artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, all this amazing stuff that they can do. They can talk, they can create video, they can create podcasts. This podcast, for example, there are several episodes that was recorded using artificial intelligence, which is amazing how it can do that. I can even interact as you could see in several episodes. So I would like to invite you to buy my book AI by Sci-Fi. It's available on Google Books, Google Play. It's also available on Amazon. So you can buy my book. If you are interested in something a little bit more complex, a little bit more technical, I do have as well technical book. For example, I have one book about computational thinking, in which I talk about Kasparov. It's a technical book. Greg Kasparov was the first guy to be beaten by a computer. He has a very nice book about that, how artificial intelligence overturned the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So please buy my book and offer me all the support. You can find all of them on Amazon. Hopefully, in the future, I'm going to write also about religion, atheism, and science. But I do have a podcast. I do have a blog called the Scientists Free from Religion. The same name of the podcast. And you can find several already publications about several topics in which talk about science, religion, and atheism. So, hope you enjoyed the show. So, let's come back to the show.
So, if an atheist selflessly dedicates their life to charity, the religious interpretation isn't that they are demonstrating inherent human morality or autonomy.
No, it's that they are simply benefiting from a borrowed divine attribute, effectively.
The credit is immediately removed from the individual and redirected to the divine source.
Exactly. The argument is that we are not observing autonomous humans creating love, but rather God sustaining creation and allowing a reflection of the divine image to persist, however imperfectly, even in those who reject him.
Banks finds this maneuver highly problematic.
He calls it a great difficulty.
What does Banks call that specific logical moves where a theological explanation steps in just to fill a gap in empirical understanding? How does he label that fallacy?
He labels it specifically as an appeal to ignorance, or the God of the gaps.
Right.
Banks contrasts the empirical nature of secular morality, which is demonstrably observable through empathy and social contracts, with the need for common grace. Secular ethics requires no prior faith commitment.
But common grace requires you to first believe in God and his intricate sovereignty just to explain the love you see in non-believers.
Right. By using common grace, the theologian is essentially closing off human autonomy with a theological fiat, preventing the possibility of independent human goodness.
And this results in what Banks identifies as a vicious circle.
It does. The doctrine attributes all love agape in believers and even philia and eros in non-believers to God. Yet simultaneously, it denies non-believers the capacity to create the love and goodness that is right there, observed in their actions.
They're credited with the result, but deny the process. It's an ownership problem that denies the human achievement.
And Banks's analogy here is beautifully cutting.
What's this one?
He compares this theological maneuver to a schoolboy who gets a lower grade on a project.
Okay.
And this boy claims that the superior work of his classmate must have actually been done by the classmate's father because no mere student could accomplish such a task by himself.
It's a mechanism for denying observable competence in your competitor.
Perfectly put. And that denial of human competence extends to his critique of Christian political philosophy as well. Banks strongly denounces Christian doctrine in politicis, meaning, in the political or social realm.
Because of its pseudo-anthropology.
This is a crucial distinction. Banks' point here is that when Christian doctrine moves into politics, it carries a fundamentally flawed blueprint for understanding society.
Because its anthropology, its understanding of humanity, isn't centered on man.
No, it's centered on an obscure God who supposedly made himself man except for sin.
So, Christian social science is inherently limited because its primary explanatory variable isn't human nature or social mechanics.
But the theological concept of sin.
Right.
Banks asserts that Christian social science is merely a segment of theology, specifically Christological and Mariological. It's focused on the perfect human, Christ, and the sinless human, Mary, not the messy reality of the rest of us.
And the fundamental explanation for all human reality is sin.
He points out that the concept of sin, as detailed in the Catechism, emphasizes the pervasive reality of sin in human history. Banks argues this explanation only makes sense if you already accept the prerequisite faith that the universe is totally ordered by God and for God.
Without that initial faith premise, the entire structure of their social and political analysis just dissolves.
It's a system designed for damage control of fallen humanity, not for autonomous human flourishing.
Banks has built this powerful case from history and theology. The track record of agape is messy, and its philosophical defense is self-referential.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Jorge Garipayers pivots the argument from the historical archives to the psychological present. He argues that the coercion hasn't stopped, it's just internalized.
It's shifted from physical burning to psychological manipulation.
Things like the angry atheist stereotype.
This transition is important because Pyers is dealing with the modern application of Banks' historical critique. Pyers is uncompromising. Christian love, he says, is deeply coercive.
And his central observation is that it demands submission under the guise of benevolence.
Right. It is the love that offers moral superiority while simultaneously holding the ultimate threat over your head, eternal torture in hell.
That is moral blackmail by any standard used outside of theological discourse.
Pyers argues this precisely. He highlights the profound ethical inconsistency. This love says, submit or burn, yet insists it is the most benevolent, self-sacrificial force in the universe.
And Pyers reminds the listener that claims of control over behavior, sexuality, relationships, even thoughts, they're almost always framed as being done out of love.
And the historical results speak for themselves. The moral alibi of love was used for violence.
Pyers states that love was the alibi for subjugation.
Exactly. History shows colonization, forced conversion, and the erasure of indigenous cultures. Pyers pointedly observes that Brazil, for instance, was not saved by Christianity, but rather subjugated, with the doctrine providing the moral justification for conquest.
And he emphasizes that this pattern of using love to justify control continues in modern political actions that prioritize authoritarianism over human rights.
Yes. Pyers notes the disturbing political reality that religious leaders and congregants in Brazil expressed the desire for military intervention, and the military dictatorship itself was often framed as a Christian government.
Yet people were still killed and disappeared.
The conclusion is inescapable. Calling political violence or personal control love does not sanctify it. It simply reveals the profound ethical distortion of the concept.
This psychological and political coercion leads Pyers to analyze the angry atheist stereotype, which he sees as a manufactured, self-fulfilling construct.
Used specifically to enforce submission and shut down intellectual critique.
It's a defense mechanism for the moral hierarchy.
It is, and Pyers meticulously outlines the cycle of confirmation bias. Step 1. An atheist asserts their autonomy by refusing religious submission, maybe by refusing prayer or moral guidance.
Step 2. This refusal is immediately interpreted not as intellectual assent, but as emotional hostility or inner pain.
Then step 3, the atheist is labeled angry or emotionally wounded. Step 4, that label provokes genuine irritation because it's a misdiagnosis and an ad hominem attack.
It's designed to dismiss the intellectual content.
Right. So finally, step 5. That resulting irritation is then taken as confirmation of the original claim. See? We told you they were angry.
It's a classic trap. And Pyers uses Karl Popper's criterion of unfalsifiability to categorize it. The label applies regardless of behavior. There's no escape.
That's the structural brilliance and cruelty of the stereotype. If the atheist is calm and intellectually precise in their refusal, their calmness is dismissed as repressed anger.
If they are assertive and clear.
It is proof of obvious anger. And if the atheist gets visibly irritated after repeated provocation, that irritation is taken as conclusive empirical evidence of the underlying anger.
So it's unfalsifiable.
Pyers concludes the category is unfalsifiable. It's designed to protect the moral hierarchy from any genuine intellectual challenge by shifting the debate instantly to the critic's emotional state.
So to counteract this coercive mind reading that defines the angry atheist stereotype, Pyers introduces a framework.
Nonviolent communication, or NVC, pioneered by Marshall Rosenberg. Pyers views NVC as a radically anti-authoritarian method that can dismantle the very structure of spiritual coercion.
What makes NVC so disruptive to a system built on spiritual authority?
Its core principle is the enforcement of self-authority, specifically the rule that forbids inferring feelings.
Okay.
Pyers details Rosenberg's key distinctions that enforce this internal ownership. You must differentiate observations from interpretations, feelings must be distinguished from evaluations, and needs should never be confused with moral judgments.
That seems like an essential tool for achieving emotional honesty, which Pyers suggests is absent in the coercive model.
It is, because NVC systematically trains the expansion of your emotional vocabulary, moving people away from simple binaries like good or bad, love or anger.
But the most crucial part
is that it establishes respect for first-person emotional authority.
Mm-hmm.
Only you get to name what you feel. No one else has access to your inner emotional life.
So if someone in a secular discussion says you're angry at me, from an NVC perspective, that's not just incorrect, it's a failure of communication.
It's a failure because they are projecting or diagnosing. Pyers states the responsibility for the uncomfortable feeling must remain with the speaker.
So the correct move, according to NVC, is ownership.
Exactly. Instead of diagnosing the other person, you're angry, the communicator must take responsibility for their internal state. When you say X, I feel uncomfortable or threatened or challenged.
It immediately shifts the discussion from diagnosing the target to owning the speaker's internal response, thereby protecting the target's autonomy.
And this framework is fundamentally incompatible with the existing structure of Christian moral culture, according to Pyers.
Why?
Because Christian moral culture depends on inferring inner states as control mechanisms. If you challenge the church's doctrine, your intellectual position is bypassed and your internal reality is narrated for you by the authority figure.
They claim to know what you really feel deep down better than you do.
The classic examples of this coercive mind-reading mechanism, the spiritual diagnosis that bypasses logic, would be phrases like, your heart is hardened, or you're resisting the truth.
Or the big one, you're secretly angry at God.
Or even the dismissive, you just want to sin. Pyers is clear. These are not accidental phrases. They are control mechanisms designed to shift the battleground from logic to spiritual pathology.
And NVC dismantles this entire structure.
It does, by insisting that external spiritual authority does not grant you the right to narrate or invalidate another person's inner life, which Pyers notes is a profound threat to any system built on spiritual authority.
Because if the pastor or priest can't tell you what you really feel or think, their power to mandate your behavior and correct your soul is profoundly diminished.
That is the structural maneuver Pyers wants the listener to recognize. When intellectually cornered, the debate instantly shifts from the content of the criticism to the critic's supposed emotional state.
Assertiveness gets confused with anger.
Assertiveness, which Pyers defines as clarity coupled with intellectual conviction, is strategically confused with anger, which is a strong, negative, affective state. And Pyers suggests this confusion is often bad faith, designed solely to protect the moral hierarchy.
This all brings us to Pyers' highly charged conclusion. The explicit preference for secular anger in its moral honesty over Christian love.
He argues that agape is fundamentally transactional and conditional, even when it claims to be unconditional.
It's not built on mutual recognition or symmetrical respect for autonomy.
No. Peirce says it's defined as paternalistic, corrective, and conditional. He labels it affection with a leash. The love is granted to pull you toward a specific, pre-approved moral outcome.
And the sources remind us that this coercive nature wasn't a mistake in theology, it was the entire point.
Absolutely. Figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and Calvin did not see a contradiction in stern, punishing love. Love was intended to correct and save the soul, often brutally, not merely to be gentle or affirming.
Peirce illustrates the terrifying consequence of this theology. One can claim to love someone while simultaneously condemning them to hell.
Denying their fundamental rights or coercing their behavior for their own good. This conditional act, defined by theological loyalty, is the moral suffocation Peirce describes. This kind of love is terrifying because it never accepts the person as they are.
And by contrast, Peirce champions the virtue of secular anger, precisely because it does not pretend to be holy or morally pure. It's transparent.
Secular anger in a secular framework functions transparently and is entirely accountable. Peirce sees it as a necessary response to observed injustice, a clear defense of personal autonomy, and a signal that boundaries have been crossed.
And crucially, it is revocable.
That's the key. If the injustice is addressed, the anger recedes. It is a temporary proportional response.
And that revocability is the key contrast with agape.
Right. Peirce states that Christian love is terrifying because it is defined as eternal and immutable. It exists to correct and mandate, and crucially, it does not listen to dissent. It cannot be revoked by the recipient.
This comparison leads Peirce to state that the entire Christian framing setting up love versus anger as the ultimate moral binary is a deception.
A strategically deployed false binary designed to limit moral response.
This is the real takeaway then, the culmination of the source's critique. Peirce concludes that the true binary is not love versus anger at all.
No. Peirce asserts the real binary is between two political and psychological states. Submission is labeled love, and resistance is labeled hostility.
If you comply, you are loving and loved. If you challenge the authority or assert your boundaries, you are, by definition, angry and hostile.
This fundamentally reframes the political and personal stakes of the entire debate for you, the listener. Being labeled angry is no longer an insult or personal pathology.
But rather, as Peirce puts it, a confession that your autonomy is working.
And that is why he asserts the preference for secular anger. It respects the right to say no, the right to dissent, and the right to autonomy, all values that Christian love, in its institutionalized, coercive, and eternal form, fundamentally fails to value or tolerate.
That was an incredibly dense and provocative deep dive into an area most people take entirely for granted, the definition and application of love and virtue.
It really was.
We have reviewed the central tension articulated by Banks and Peirce, the conflict between empirical, autonomous, secular morality, championed by Silva,
And the theologically mandated, conditional, and ultimately coercive nature of Christian agape.
Banks showed us how history reveals the violent and narcissistic consequences of a love that must be prioritized above the person being loved.
And Peirce exposed the psychological structure, the unfalsifiable, angry, atheist stereotype, used to protect a system based on mandated submission by denying the emotional ownership and autonomy of the critic.
This deep dive showed us how profoundly philosophical and moral battles are fought, not on the battlefield, but over the definitions of basic concepts like love and anger.
And it underscored the essential necessity of using historical context to scrutinize any moral claim that asserts inherent, untouchable superiority.
You have to ask not only what the moral system promises, but what its historical and psychological application actually permits.
And if we accept the premise that moral systems should ultimately be judged by their historical consequences and their capacity to tolerate non-submission, that is, their willingness to accept a no, this raises an important question for you, the listener, to mull over.
What's that?
If secular anger is defined as moral honesty, what other universally praised virtues, such as obedience, humility, or even forgiveness, might need to be rigorously reassessed outside their common cultural or religious framing?
And what is the true societal cost of a system of affection that demands compliance and cannot tolerate genuine autonomous disagreement?
A compelling final thought, forcing us to recognize that sometimes the most challenging emotions might be the most honest.
Thank you for providing the fascinating sources and intellectual challenge for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
Hey there, you arrived to the end of this episode. You can always check out my YouTube channel and also keep watching because there are 7 episodes. So you just if you enjoyed this one, hopefully you are going to enjoy the next one. I always like to remember that you can support my work by buying my books. Even though I still don't have a book about religion, which is the main topic of the podcast, I do have a book about artificial intelligence. And also I have a blog called Scientists Free From Religion on Medium. And there are several blog posts there. And you can enjoy it, you can read it. And you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can share it with your friends. So hopefully I can hear from you and hope you had an amazing time. So hope to see you in the next episode.